दावत देता हूँ मुख्तार तकरीर के लिए मोहम्मद कासिम।
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह वस्सलातु वस्सलामु अला सय्यिदिना व मौलाना व हबीबिना व क़ुर्रति अयुनिना अबी ज़हरा अल-बतूल सल्लल्लाहु तआला अलैहि व अला आलिहि व अस्हाबिहि व अज़वाजिहि व अबawayhi wa abai wa ummi ummahati nawabil kirami wa baraka wa sallama. Alhamdulillah, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has allowed us to gather here again to remember Him, to remember His beloved Habib sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and to remember those beloved to the beloved Habib sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and specific to Khwajgan of Mura Sharif radiallahu anhum ajma'in. In a Sahih narration, the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, أَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى مِلَاكِ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ الَّذِي تَصِيبُ بِهِ خَيْرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he puts out a question. He says, shall I not tell you about the foundations of this entire affair that we have, the thing that we call Islam? Shall I not teach you about the foundations of this entire thing that will allow you to gain success in this dunya and the next? And then the Prophet ﷺ mentions four things. The first thing the Prophet ﷺ, he says, عَلَيْكَ بِأَهْلِ مَجَالِسِ الذِّكْرِ. He says, it is necessary upon you to accompany yourself with those that are constantly in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the wording is very interesting. The Prophet ﷺ doesn't say, engage in the dhikr of Allah as the first response. He says, be with those that have been in the majalis of dhikr. Right, that's the first thing. And it's very interesting. Then the Prophet ﷺ says, the second thing, وَإِذَا خَلَوْتَ فَحَرِّكْ لِسَانَكَ مَسْتَطَعْتَ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. And then when you're alone, when you're away from these people, then move your tongue as much as you can to whatever Allah has allowed you to, facilitated you to remember Allah. Move your tongue as much as you can in the remembrance of Allah. That's step number 2. Step number 3, وَأَحِبَّ فِي اللَّهِ. And step number 4, وَأَبْغِضْ فِي اللَّهِ. Love for the sake of Allah and then hate for the sake of Allah. Like, this is the entire foundation of this entire religion. If you were to summarize it, this is the summary. Be with those that are constantly engaged with the dhikr of Allah. If not, then engage with the dhikr of Allah. And then the final two things that you're required to do is love for the sake of Allah and hate for the sake of Allah. Now, usually, when we speak about loving for the sake of Allah, we refer to, or we're speaking about how we love one another. So we love our brothers or our sisters or the people of this ummah for the sake of Allah. But there's a type of love for Allah that is only for Allah, and it's because of Allah, and it's by Allah, and it's through Allah. And that's worshipping Allah because He is worthy of worship, because of your love for Him. Like in a Sahih narration, the Prophet ﷺ, Sayyidina Abu Hurairah mentions that one day the Prophet ﷺ, he smiles. He says, "Istadhaka Rasulullah ﷺ." One day the Prophet ﷺ, he smiled. And then the Prophet ﷺ explains why he's smiling. He says, "Ajibtu li aqwamin yukaduna ila al-jannati fi salasil wa hum karihun." It's really strange. The Prophet ﷺ, he smiles one day and he says, I am astonished by a type of people that will enter Jannah handcuffed. Like, we've heard of people being handcuffed and taken to Jahannam. These are the type of people that will be handcuffed and taken to Jannah. Right? And the ulama, they explain that on the Day of Judgment, Sa'id ibn Jubair and others, they explain, on the Day of Judgment, Allah will bring about a nation of kuffar. And He will say to them, you would give your life for these statues that you wish to worship. Right? You would give your life for them. Now I'm commanding you, udkhulu Jahannam. Enter into the hellfire. And they will all stop. At the same time, Allah will bring about a nation of believers. And He will say to them, in kuntum ahibba'i fadkhulu Jahannam. If you truly love me, enter Jahannam. And the narration mentions, فَيَقْتَحِمُونَ. They will begin to race with one another, hoping to enter into Jahannam, only because Allah has said. Why? Because they worshipped Allah, not because of Jannah. They didn't worship Allah because to feel good. They worshipped Allah because He is worthy of worship, out of pure love for Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that kind of love, it does strange things to people, extremely strange things. Like, say, the Rabi al-Adawiyya, Rabi al-Basariya, she says that if on the Day of Judgment Allah is to call out to me in front of the entire creation, and He says, Ya amatasu, oh you evil, wicked woman, she says that's more beloved to me than everything in this entire dunya. Why? Because Allah has spoken to me. It doesn't matter what He says, He's spoken to me. That's the kind of love that I have. Like Imam al-Kharkushi, radiallahu anhu warda, in his book on Adab al-Tasawwuf, he says there's a woman, and she's crying, and she says like, لَقَدْ سَئِمْتُ مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ حتى لو يباع الموت في السوق لاشتريته. Like, I am so fed up with life, I wish I could buy death at the marketplace. I would buy it so I could die. And a man says to this woman, he says, do you not fear Allah? Like, are you so confident in what you've done in this life that you can buy death and just die and think Allah won't punish you? And she says, أَفَتَرَاهُ يُعَذِّبُنِي وَأَنَا أُحِبُّهُ. Do you see Allah? Do you really think Allah would punish me whilst I love Him? Like, why would He do that? Like, why would Allah punish me if I love Him? Because He loves me even more. Right? Like Qadi Shurayh radiallahu anhu warda, he says one day, Imam Khwarizmi mentions this in his Manaqib. He says, one day I entered into Masjid al-Nabawi and I see Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He's wiping dust and he's wiping it on his face. So he's grabbing dust from the floor and he's beginning to wipe his face and he's crying profusely. This is Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Right? He's grabbing dust and he's wiping his face and he's crying. And Qadi Shurayh says, I go closer to Imam Hussein and I can hear him saying these words. He says, he's calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, أَلَمَ قَامِ الْحَدِيدِ خَلَقْتَ أَعْضَائِي أَمْ لِشُرْبِ الْحَمِيمِ خَلَقْتَ أَمْعَائِي إلهي إن طالبتني بذنوبي لأطالبنك بكرمك وإن حبست عيني مع الخاطئين لأخبرنهم بحبي لك. Right? Imam Hussein, he's crying. He says, oh Allah, did you create my limbs so that they could become recipients of the rods of hellfire? Oh Allah, did you create my intestines so I'd have to drink the boiling, scaling water of hellfire? Oh Allah, if you take me to account for my sins, I will take you to account for your generosity. وَإِنْ حَبَسْتَنِي مَعَ الْخَاطِئِينَ لَأُخْبِرَنَّهُمْ بِحُبِّي لَكَ. And if you gather me and you raise me with the wrongdoers, with the criminals, I will still tell them how much I love you. That's Imam Hussein. He says, Ya Allah, if you were to raise me with those people that are wrongdoers, I will still tell them how much I love you. إلهي إن طاعتك لا تنفعك ومعصيتي لا تضرك فهب لي ما لا ينفعك واغفر لي ما لا يضرك فإنك أنت أرحم الراحمين. Like Imam Hussein, he says, Ya Allah, so grant me that which doesn't benefit you, meaning your obedience, and forgive me for that which doesn't harm you. فإنك أنت أرحم الراحمين, because you are the one that shows the most mercy out of all of them. And this kind of love purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it does very strange things in the life of a normal human being, in the life of those people that love and see through that lens of wanting to love the ummah. Right? Sayyidi Shaykh al-Akbar, as a final point before I finish. Sayyidi Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi radiallahu anh, he says that there was a man in my vicinity who disliked Ghawth Abu Madyan. Ghawth Abu Madyan was considered one of Shaykh al-Akbar's teachers. He says there was a man who would dislike Ghawth Abu Madyan. And so I began to dislike him. I disliked him. He says, I fell asleep and I see the Prophet ﷺ in my dream. And the Prophet ﷺ says that, لِمَا بَغَدْتَهُ, like, why do you hate this man? And Sayyidi Shaykh al-Akbar, he says, Ya Rasulullah, I hate this man لِبُغْضِهِ فِي أَبِي مَدْيَنَ. I hate this man because he dislikes Ghawth Abu Madyan. And the Prophet ﷺ says that, أَلَيْسَ هُوَ يُحِبُّ اللَّهَ وَيُحِبُّنِي. But does he not love Allah and does he not love me? Fine, he dislikes your teacher. Fine, he is not from your madhab. Fine, he's not from your masjid. Fine, he's not from your tariqah. So be it. Does he not love me? Does he not love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Sayyid Shaykh al-Akbar, he says, of course he does. And then the Prophet ﷺ says to Sayyid Shaykh al-Akbar that أَحْبِبْهُ فِي حُبِّي, أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, then love him for my sake and love him for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, that's the kind of things that happen when someone loves for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like the Prophet, in the Sahih narration, the Prophet also mentions, لو أن رجلان تحابا في الله لجمع الله بينهما يوم القيامة وقال هذا الذي كنت تحبه فيه. Like if two people love each other, and the Prophet also mentions واحد في المشرق وواحد في المغرب. If one is in the east and one is in the west, right? Allah will gather them on the day of judgment. Here's your exclusive meeting for the person that you love, even if you couldn't see him. And Allah will introduce you to one another and then say, for me, you would love one another. Now here's your fruit for it. Now you can meet one another. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those that love everyone from this ummah, that love the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Muslim or non-Muslim, through that lens of loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وأتوب إليه.